you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We're coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. Right, this is just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do have an upcoming event that you can find more information here on our website. We do offer advertising in our newsletter, so you can email this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Today our speaker is Tony Haneke, and he's going to be covering OTA, FAD, or Here to Stay. Tony, thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mallory, and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Why don't we turn the slide? I appreciate you joining us this afternoon for the first of two programs that are going to talk about other transaction agreements, also known as OTAs. In this first program, we're going to essentially cover the lay of the land. In the other program, we'll delve a little bit more into the weeds of these different types of agreements. I might note as we get started that this is one of those rare situations where a company that has lived most of its existence in the commercial world may actually be more comfortable than a company that has spent its existence entrenched in the fields of government contracts. Although all in all, it's a vehicle that has the potential for almost any company working in innovative and cutting-edge solutions. Next page, please. So what is an OTA? It's perhaps unique in the government sphere that there's not an affirmative definition for something. Instead, it's characterized by what it's not. Besides being, it has to be authorized by Congress to a particular agency, and it's a legally binding instrument. What's interesting is it is something other than a government contract, grant, or cooperative agreement that's subject to the federal procurement laws. So to a good extent, they're really free-form commercial agreements. If we may turn the page, please. So how did they come about? It's a long history. It dates back to when President Eisenhower was the president. And he signed the NASA Act in creating NASA, and in the process created OTAs somewhat out of desperation when the United States had fallen behind the Russians in the space race after they had launched a dog into space, and we were concerned that we were falling behind. Eisenhower and Congress authorized OTAs, however, without offering any guidance, just authorized them, with the idea being that it would allow the government to buy knowledge that companies that did not normally engage with the federal government might be willing to share. The history books will tell you that government contracting back in the 50s and 60s was very different than it is today, and thus this was really something quite different. Next page. If we come forward some 50 years, the government procurement world has obviously changed a great deal and endeavors to be much more customer friendly to commercial types of companies. Nonetheless, it's still a relatively hidebound and regulatory driven environment in which many companies still refuse to participate. Thus, Congress over the years has gradually granted OTA authorities of different kinds to many of the federal agencies, which in turn delegate that to their subcomponents. There are about 11 agencies that have been granted it. I've listed the major ones here, and there are a number of sub-agencies that also engage. Next, please. So what are OTAs used for? The key thing is that OTAs may not be used, in theory, for anything which might be purchased by the government through a FAR-based contract or secured by a grant or cooperative agreement. It is supposed to be reserved for addressing the truly challenging issues where the government needs to reach outside of its comfort zone and its normal procurement methodologies to attract the best, the brightest, and the most innovative amongst industry, academia, and the finance world to develop solutions to the really tough problems. On this page, we've included some of the kinds of areas where agencies have been digging in over the years. There are scores and scores of projects that have been developed. Next page. So for what purpose can an agency use an OTA? As I said before, Congress has granted differing types of authorities to the various agencies, but they generally fall into three groupings. One is R&D, research and development, to spur development of advanced technologies and with possible commercial application. That's an advancement of what has been done by a number of years by agencies. The second is prototyping, which is really to advance or improve on products that have been developed either through R&D or solutions that exist and they're trying to find the next generation. And then the third one, which is fairly new, which is a follow-on production contract without competition, is something that allows a product to be produced from a successful prototype effort. So let's turn the page and go on to some of the ground rules for engaging in these kind of programs. First, as I said, there are a number of agency variations. We're going to use the DoD model, which is explained very well in their other transactions guide. DoD by far is the most active, and its components are most active in participating in the OTA process. So the first type, as we said, is R&D. It's fairly unregulated. There are not many restrictions on it. It has to be infeasible or inappropriate for a normal grant system or an agreement. So again, it's looking into the highly innovative and again, seeking to encourage companies that haven't participated before. It has to be work that doesn't duplicate what's already going on in the Department of Defense. So there has to be some internal research by the government before it engages in this. And the other part is that it's a cost-sharing effort with the private sector having to contribute about 50% to the ongoing effort. Next page, please. So the second one is prototypes. And the short version is that this is where you're taking R&D or you're taking R&D and trying to develop a product from it, or you're taking a product and trying to enhance or improve a new product. You know, it could be a new cyber device, a new cyber technology, or to the more mundane, the Army recently went through an OTA process to try and develop a new system of delivering fuel and water to the front lines of a battlefield. And that was sort of a new improvement on how things are done. As part of this, though, there are a number of key requirements. The second of is there has to be significant involvement from a non-traditional contractor, nonprofit research outfit, or a small business. This is the whole focus of the prototyping. This is not to be something done by the traditional contractors in the main. If you don't have significant involvement of a nonprofit contractor, which is defined there, a non-traditional contractor is an entity that has not been a prime or subcontractor that is subject to full cost accounting standards in the prior year. As a footnote to that, that of course means that you don't always have to be small. There are a number of very large civilian contractors that engage in mostly fixed price, but not cost accounting, that are allowed to participate in these programs as a non-traditional contractor. But the idea is that you bring together a team from academia, maybe some financial support, a non-traditional contractor to come up with a solution. The third condition allows for the potential for large traditional contractors that are CAS covered to participate, but they're required to kick in 33% of the cost of the project. For some of these large contractors, that investment is small potatoes given the potential return. Next page, please. So this is the golden egg or the golden ring on the carousel, because what we're talking about is a sole source follow-on production contract that could be tremendously rewarding at the end of the day. However, the requirements here are that the prototype, that it's a follow-on to a prototype OTA that made provision for this type of opportunity. If it doesn't, you can't follow on with one. The prototype transaction itself must have been competitive in its award, so it couldn't have been a sole source prototype development so that you might go from R&D to prototype to production. There has to be true competition in that process. And the third is that the prototype transaction had to be successfully completed under the terms of that stage of the agreement. You know, in this regard, the historical purpose of OTAs was always to buy knowledge. If you look at this third condition, it's been recognized that the opportunity to make money on the fruits of one's labor is a further incentive for companies that might not otherwise engage in the government. And that increases even more when, under the terms of an OTA, you are allowed to commercialize the product you might have developed. Next page, please. So the question then becomes, is should a company get involved? And really on this page, we've set out kind of the positive side of why people get involved and as an alternative to government contracting. The goal of this entire program is to recruit non-traditional contractors. The budget over the past few years has been growing exponentially, but is still a tiny part of the overall procurement budget of the government, and particularly of the Department of Defense, which has been most aggressive. The potential barriers to entry are very low, particularly if you go on the consortium route, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. It's really contracting per agreement. It's contracting in the commercial world rather than by regulation. There's no set format. You can negotiate the deal that best suits you, although I will tell you that often in these circumstances, the government increasingly is offering up a template that it will suggest, but as they will themselves note, this is really an opening offer and all terms pretty much are negotiable. There's no FAR provisions, and I'd note on this line, no FAR and then flexibility should be on separate lines. And by no FAR, there's no TINA, there's no Contract Disputes Act, no protests, no costs, no Procurement Integrity Act, no BIDOL, no government-free workplace, all that kind of stuff that hinders and creates bureaucracy in a government contract missing. So it leaves contractors in the government to collaborate, which is another key aspect of OTAs, is the ongoing collaboration with the government in these types of situations to come up with the best practices and the best solutions. There's less oversight, there's very little auditing, there's little red tape, and perhaps most importantly, there are no formal IP rules. In the government procurement world, there are kind of three stages or three levels of government rights. Here, there are none, and you can negotiate whatever it is that you can agree to with the government, which often is that the government gets minimum rights. There are some laws that apply, sort of the federal fiscal laws, the criminal laws, the fraud laws, they all apply, and the civil rights laws, and then you have to be able to do business in the United States. I will note that in a number of these agreements, if it's particularly with the Department of Defense or certain other agencies, that there may be a restriction on foreign participation. But essentially what we're talking about is a commercial arrangement. And if the agency properly plays with it on its side, it is supposed to assign staff to administer these things outside of the contracts office. That is honored in the breach all too often, but the idea is to create a more flexible teaming partner with the commercial side. Next page, please. So is there a downside? You know, for a traditional government contractor, there might be some unease in the lack of the FAR protections. there are some nice things about the terminations and changes clauses and claims and said IP rights. There's a comfort level in that, and that's missing. The fact is you have to negotiate your own rights, which is good and bad. Depending on the circumstance, there's only limited protest protection, and it's now restricted to the district courts primarily, although the GAO has a small window. And the protest right only exists at the OTA level. If you're engaged as a subcontractor or in a consortium, you really have no protest rights at all when you don't win the desired award. There's also limited access to the government if you're in a consortium arrangement. You're working through a manager. The disputes clause is left up to you, so it's something that needs to be paid attention to. And when I talk about protecting IP, it's up to you, and you have to pay attention to it at all levels. At each level, whether it's between the government and yourself, or the government and a consortium, or the consortium and your company. It all can vary. Let's go to the next page. So how does one get involved, assuming that one has not been turned off up to this point? You know, there are different types of OTA arrangements. There's direct engagement, or the government handles it. Let me back up. The government handles OTAs in different ways, but essentially they fall into two categories. First, there can be direct engagement. The government can simply send out a broad agency announcement or publish a white paper, and it won't necessarily do it on what will be the SAM's opportunities page, the old FedBizOps. They will reach out into all sorts of media that they haven't used before, seeking potential interest in participating in an OTA. They can issue a one-off OTA, or they might bring in a group of companies that would work directly with the government, managed by the government or by an intermediary coordinator. The other is to work through consortia. And consortia have become the most popular method used particularly by DoD and some others. It's comprised of a group of traditional and non-traditional government contractors who organize around a specific technological area. And if you go Google consortia or OTA consortia, there are scores of them that have been created since the early 90s. And the consortia range from the small with maybe 5 members on a very targeted approach to some of the very large ones which have 1,000 members or more, which I might note for some companies proves to be a problem in securing participation in programs. The consortia, for the most part, they have similar characteristics. They have low barriers to entry and a very short and simple application. So it's easy to get on the team. And then the idea is that as opportunities flow into the consortium from the government, you will be allowed to bid and team up with various members of the consortium and hopefully have a winning solution. The other key aspect of a consortia is that it is run by a manager, either self-managed by the members or by a consortium management team that collects a fee in return for its management services. Next page, please. So what do these agreements look like? A standalone OTA is between the government and the participants. It's freely negotiated, and it's essentially a commercial contract. There are not very many of them posted on the web, but the ones that we've reviewed, there's really not much that's going to surprise you. The OTA may or may not have a statement of work, depending on whether it's sort of a one project OTA or something longer that will use task orders. But it talks about scope and project management and structure. It's a little bit like the terms and conditions of a commercial contract. And then the question is whether the statement of work and the pricing will be part of the OTA or whether it'll be part of some kind of a project tasking. That's how they might be different. But it deals with modifications and payment and access to records which is very limited under OTAs, and how you're going to deal with disputes, which you've got to deal with. Most importantly, there's a free-for-all on patent and data rights. It'll talk about industry preferences, U.S. industry preference, which is always an issue. And as I said before, depending on the agency, there may be restrictions on participation by foreign entities or the extent to which information or the results of the program can be transferred to foreign powers. And then, of course, there are the standard terms that you'd find in any other agreement. Let's go to the next page. So these same types of OTAs, if you're in a consortium environment, are negotiated between the federal government and the OTA consortium manager. And let's talk a little bit about the consortium manager. These managers are of various types and structures, but if you were to break them into two components, they're the managers that are really simply conduits that pass paper back and forth between the members of a consortium and the government does all the work. The more useful kind of consortium is ones that have a technical staff in that area that they're professing to have expertise, and they assist the members in collaborating, in developing solutions to the requests that the government might submit, and then passing them back and forth. The consortium agreement that exists between the members and the managers is, again, a fairly commercial transaction. If you think of this, though, the consortium agreement, which is really a collaboration agreement, it talks about the member fees, the percentage of management fee that you're going to do, and the terms that you're going to participate by. So it talks about member obligations and relationships, how they're going to manage the project assignment process, how they're going to manage the assessment of offers that are sent up to the government, how they are going to act as managers vis-a-vis the whole team in successfully completing the project. The other agreement that occurs in the consortium world is the project agreement. And that's really the statement of work and the pricing. And it can be handled in two manners. Some consortia have a master project agreement, which really set out the substantive terms that will govern the engagement between the government, the members and the management team in performing a government project. When you use that method, it has all of the terms that will apply to all future projects, and then the task order that comes out may be a very short one-page statement of work. In other situations, what happens is the project agreements are negotiated on a one-off basis. Let's turn the page, please. So the process, I wanted to talk about this before we deal with the penultimate question of what's going to happen with these OTAs. If you think about the process, and it applies whether it's a standalone or a consortium arrangement. The government has a problem, and it decides that OTAs is a solution. It will issue an invitation to submit some kind of short response, some kind of proposal or white paper, maybe 3 or 5 pages. Based upon that review, it will down select to some people that will be offered the opportunity to do more of a formal presentation, often a 30-minute or 1-hour oral presentation. And based on that, the government will issue a tasking either directly to the OTA participants in a standalone arrangement, or they'll issue it to the consortium manager in a consortium environment. And then the consortium manager will go through the process of negotiating a project agreement, in passing out the funds, and in helping the members actually produce the work. Let's go to the last page. So that's the environment in which we live. The question is whether it's a fad or not. It's certainly popular. OTAs are a lot like a spring flower to a bee. There are all sorts of people that want to become involved, and you can see that one can be involved at the OTA level, one can be a consortium member, and one also could be a subcontractor to a consortium member. So all of this interest and all of the money flowing in has raised some concerns with IG offices and with the GAO, who have complained a bit about the lack of accountability, the lack of controls, some seeming abuses, things like that. And if there continue to be abuses, of course, it's likely to have more restrictions. What we've seen in Congress is not a groundswell at all against them. They like them as a creative opportunity, but it's likely that we're going to see additional reporting requirements on an annual basis by the government, but with an eye to the fact that if you put in too much reporting, you get back into the nightmare of a government contract when it takes a year to do procurements. This entire process, because there's collaboration between the government and the members, all of this can occur in but a few months. Consortium agreements can take but 3 months. OTAs can take 3 months. So you can be in business pretty quickly. There have also been some alternatives. The GSA has come out with a FISM. It's a rapid commercial contracting process, so there'll continue to be alternatives. But at the end of the day, OTAs may be a little bit like ANCs, Alaska Native Corporations. They get criticized every so often, but I would expect that this type of agreement is going to have a long and rewarding life for those that participate in it. Next page. I thank you very much for the time that you've spent with me today. My telephone number and email is there if anybody has questions, and I thank Jennifer Schaus and company for letting me participate today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, for joining us today. If you have any questions, please contact him directly with the email or phone number shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.